Well, Lamola's comments lead us to our panel tonight, where we're focusing on South Africa's diplomatic stance on conflicts around the world, including, of course, the Middle East. To join the conversation as well by sending your comments or questions via WhatsApp on the number 072-110-5584, or give us a call on this number 010-594-6010. Let's now speak to former diplomat and international relations expert Dr. Kingsley Makhubela. We also will speak to international relations expert advocate Sipho Mantula and the executive director of political economy Southern Africa, Biniza, also joining us this evening. Gentlemen, a good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. There is so much to look at, but perhaps Dr. Makhubela, let's start with you and start with just the South African stance on what is happening in the Middle East already. So we've got that clip by Lamola that we played just moments ago, wherein he says the closing down of the Israeli embassy is a decision that will be left up to cabinet. But at the moment, the Israeli embassy remains downgraded. You've got, of course, a statement coming out from Durko and the South African government condemning the Israeli attacks on Iran. So South Africa, I don't know how you view this as we put forward the stance that we have already sort of made it clear which side we're leaning. What do you make of that?
Naledi, thanks very much. And thanks for, to other panelists. What the minister didn't say is what would be the recommendation of the Department of International Relations to the cabinet. Because DECO, it's a focal point on foreign policy matters. DECO advises government on foreign policy matters. So he should have stated what these recommendations are. My view has always been, Naledi, and is that diplomacy is part of the battlefield. It's part of the statecraft that you got to utilize. I don't think once you have established diplomatic relation, you have to easily sever these relations. And given the fact that you are in a conflict area there, you need your diplomats on the ground to give you a better understanding of the situation. In the absence of any diplomatic presence, you're likely to work on the basis of hearsay.
Yeah, we're obviously going to be looking at what the future might hold then for that decision. But there's the work that's being done by the president abroad as part of that G7 summit, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But Sia, let's bring you in here, because for many South Africans, I think the key question to answer is why what happens in the Middle East could matter and should matter for us. And now I'm going to get into, I suppose, the political and economic implications here. In South Africa, we've already started talking about the rising prices of Brent crude oil, how that's going to impact the everyday South African. And perhaps as you reflect on that, why our political leadership needs to be considering what to say and do next very carefully.
So, look, I think what you're raising, Naledi, is the multiple sort of interests that the South African government has to weigh and trade off with one another. But I think, unfortunately, at this point, a lot has kind of been determined in a way. If you give South Africa's posture in international relations, given by the fact that we led the charge against Israel's genocide in Gaza, and that sort of set the stage in terms of what is expected of South Africa. Whilst South African politicians and I think state officials might equally be comparing the economic trade-offs and costs and benefits, it seems as though there's very little you can put aside, as sort of what is morally comprehensible or what you're willing to stomach, versus what is ostensibly human rights violations led by the Israeli government, but also an escalation now that's becoming regional, which again is linked to the Israeli question in general, but also which position people take. Unfortunately, I heard the comments earlier during the news clip of, suggesting that we shouldn't take sides. I think, unfortunately, in this current geopolitical climate we're in, not choosing a side is inevitably choosing a side, right? But not having a stance against what you perceive as human rights violations, genocide, etc., is actually taking a stance in support of it. And I think South Africa, in this point, has very little room, I think, to say nothing. And I think the global expectation is that South Africa is going to take the moral route in this conflict. And obviously, South Africa is always and will continue to be a government that prioritizes diplomacy over conflict. And that's always going to be our fallback. But in this conflict, it seems as though doomed if we do, doomed if we don't, because on the one hand, you've got what would be BRICS members soon. But at the same time, you've also got the perpetrator of the genocide that South Africa raised the charge against in the ICJ, and that matter, whether or not Israel has complied with the ICJ's decisions or not, is still a subject that's quite clear as to South Africa's moral stance in that. And so one would expect South Africa to have a specific leaning, but obviously the basics of diplomacy over everything is going to continue to be our stance in this conflict.
Yeah. Advocate Sipho Mandula joins us now. And Advocate, let me bring you in here, because what you have at the moment is, as Biniza puts it, that, a position where South Africa really, it's a sense of damned if you do, damned if you don't. And that our position on what happens in the Middle East is already clear as a result of the case that we've taken to the ICJ. But yesterday I had a conversation with an analyst, an Andre Schwartz, who was speaking to us from Prague, very much still concerned that there might very well be nuclear capability for war that is being built within Iran. I mean, that's the sort of positioning that he's taken on the discussion. But one of the things that he talked about, Advocate, when asked what South Africa should be doing, is he said that South Africa's moral, I suppose, responsibility to speak on wars should be on all wars and not just focusing on what happens in the Middle East. He went on to speak about where is South Africa, where South Sudan is concerned. I reflect on how we've got our soldiers coming back from the DRC. I mean, what you make of that discussion? Can you have all of those topics being tackled by South African government?
Evening, Naledi, even to my fellow panelists, to the viewers. Naledi, I think when we ground our foreign policy, even post-94, we've been focusing on the African continent. You will understand, the first, we've been playing either as a power player or as the peacemaker and as a peacekeeper. And looking at both your DRC, your Central African Republic, you look at Burundi, and in your panel having an institutional memory there like Ambassador Kingsley, he will attest that our foreign policy has been dealing with more than 6 pillars. That will include non-alignment, that will include adherence to international law, and others will add continental law, multilateralism that is moving towards the multipolarity, diplomacy that we have to shake and shape now in the 21st century, looking at the geopolitics, whether the conflicts in the Middle East, but the conflicts that are also in the Sahel, and the conflicts that we see in the Great Lakes. And you'll recall that last month, Minister Lamola was in Uganda, and the two countries that were at the center of that debate was DRC and Sudan, and both Sudans. Normally we'll talk about the North Sudan and forget the South Sudan. Another conflict that we might have even, have lost sight on it is the conflict that are in the Horn of Africa, your Mogadishu, the conflict in Eritrea, Ethiopia that was going on in the north. And South Africa has played that key role. And finally, I will say to you, the other two pillars will include a peaceful and a meaningful dialogue. And I think in this state, one must not be misconstrued to be talking about only the national dialogue methodology, but talking about peaceful and multilateral dialogue that include all parties that are in any conflict.
Right.
And finally, our commitment to what we'll call being clear, progressive on the Pan-Africanism and internationalism. Naledi, those pillars ground us on our road that we are not being seen to be concerned with the conflict in Russia and Ukraine, Israel and Iran, Israel and Middle East, but we have also been seized with all the conflicts that are in the African continent. And in some instances, we are stretched by resources, we are stretched by, in terms of capability, in terms of defense, and at the same time, intelligence gathering.
Okay.
And I think the last part will include the role of mediators, which should include both women and young people who are almost what I'll call the victims of all these conflicts.
Absolutely. You know, we're going to take some calls on this, but what I want to do is start to move the conversation away then from just the perspective of South Africa. You've got Twitter conversations that are taking place. It's X now, of course. Donald Trump has taken to X to comment on what is happening between Israel and Iran. So has Bernie Sanders in the US. We're going to be looking at that as well. And you've got Iran leadership also releasing videos. We'll share some of that content with you. But let's take calls quickly. Chris is in Balito. Chris, good evening. Thank you so much for calling.
Yeah, thanks.
Talk to me, Chris. Thanks for calling.
Can I get in?
Yes, you're live. Chris, go ahead.
Yes. I mean, if we take into account the events of the First and the Second World Wars, nobody emerged from these two wars and said, I have won. In any war situation, quite often there are no winners. On both sides, there are casualties. And what we leave behind, we leave a trail of destruction. All social economic services also get destroyed, and we cause unbearable miseries to human beings. So what I'm actually saying is that South Africa should be praised by nations of the world for insisting that we rather engage in dialogue and negotiation.
Okay.
And to solve international conflicts through dialogue and negotiations, and not through armed conflict and wars, because these, in the end, bring about no peace, and that is not in the interest of any country,
right,
and not in the interest of even rich or poor people. Insofar as that is concerned, we are all sufferers. We emerge sufferers.
Yeah, Chris, thank you so much. A very strong point there. And it's interesting because I immediately think about the role that South Africa played in mediating the tensions in Ethiopia and the Tigray region through dialogue. Let's take one more caller. Samuel is in Bloemfontein. Samuel, good evening.
Good evening.
Yes, thank you for calling, Samuel. Talk to us.
South Africa has to because Batubana might say Palestinian. I salute properly. So today,
okay. All right. Your line isn't great, Samuel Kidoho. I'm going to release you. I'm going to let you go. But thank you so much for calling. A quick translation there. Samuel, of course, saying that the war between Israel and Palestine has been going on for many years, and perhaps this isn't something that South Africa should be involving itself in. But let's start to look at what the future looks like for tensions between now Israel and Iran. The likelihood that talks will continue, especially as you see leadership of the G7 meeting. Could there be interesting outcomes to come out of that? We'll challenge all of that on the other side of this. Stay with us.
درود میفرستیم به ارواح مطهر شهدا. رژیم صهیونی در یک اقدام تجاوزکارانه در پوشش اهداف
All right, so what you're looking at there is a video released today by Major General Mousavi, Chief of Staff of the Iranian Armed Forces, wherein he warns of imminent retaliatory strikes on Israel following attacks that killed civilians and journalists in Iran. You would have seen that yesterday, saying that Israel and Tel Aviv and Haifa should evacuate soon, as past strikes were just sort of a warning, and warnings will not continue. But he says, in the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, we send our salutations to the pure souls of the martyrs. The Zionist regime, in an aggressive action under the guise of targeting military objectives, attacked the Iranian people, including women, children, and the elderly. I'm taking just a snippet from the translation of that video that you're looking at. A lot of this communication coming in from various role players. In fact, let's go all the way across the pool now, where we then look at what's coming out of the United States. Donald Trump also taking to social media, U.S. President, and we bring up that tweet for you to see what it was that he's had to say there. In one post, he says, unconditional surrender. He demands, he says, we know exactly where the so-called supreme leader is hiding. He's an easy target, but is safe there. We're not going to take him out, or at least for now, but we don't want missiles shot at civilians or American soldiers. Our patience is wearing thin. Thank you for your attention to this matter. Of course, we'll ask Dr. Makubela if what we're hearing from Trump is a consideration that the U.S., according to Trump, really wanting to enter the fray here. At the same time, you've got Senator Bernie Sanders, who's taken also to social media to say the Constitution of the United States is very clear. There is no ambiguity. It is Congress that determines whether we go to war, not the president. Trump must not take legal military action against Iran. Let's continue to speak to our panel on this. Dr. Makubela, what you make of some of those interactions? You have Iran saying the warnings of retaliatory strikes may not very well be there moving forward as we continue to hit at Israel. Seemingly Trump wanting to enter the battlefield, but getting some contestation from his government.
You know, Naledi, President Trump has been blowing cold and hot air. When he left Canada yesterday, he said this war must come to an end between Israel and Iran. And now I've seen a number of tweets that he has sent, but I do know that lawmakers are coming up with a process to tie up his hand, not to unilaterally take a decision to go to war without consulting Congress. And that's going to be the most interesting part of the whole thing. But Naledi, the United States going to war would create serious ramification, not only for the Middle East, for the whole world, because they would go in direct confrontation with the Russians, with the Chinese. China has made it quite clear that what the attack on Iran by Israel has been, they crossed the red line. Now, they never define what is entailing that crossing the red line, but crossing the red line means they've gone further than what is normally accepted. Now, lady, there are two critical risks that we need to look at that would have serious impact on us. I've seen this morning that the Iranians are considering closing the Strait of Hormuz. And they've been in discussion, it seems, with the Houthis to close down the Strait of Bab al-Mandab. Now, the Strait of Hormuz, to put it in context, Naledi, is to understand that it transports about 30% of the global oil goes through that. And 50% of global oil is in the Middle East, but 30% goes through the Strait of Hormuz. And 20% of global gas goes through the Strait of Hormuz. That's why you're seeing people like Stammer are very much unsettled by the possibilities. The German chancellor is also unsettled because if they do that, the projection is that the oil prices may possibly even hit $300 per barrel. Even though JP Morgan is speculating that if this conflict goes on as it is now, would probably push the price of Brent crude oil to about $130, because currently it's at between 70 and 73. It has been moving that. But there have been attacks on the energy infrastructures in Haifa, even in Iran. So it's really going to cause serious challenges. Can you imagine with the amount of money we're paying for petrol now, if the prices were to go high, even for $130, it would be serious burden. And given the challenges of the global economy that is not growing that much, the global debt that Naledi runs at $317 trillion, and the global economy is just slightly growing. The size of the global economy is $117 trillion. So it raises serious challenges in terms of the sustainability of the global economy and the likelihood of unrest in some of the Western countries if this energy crisis is to be compounded by what's going on in the Middle East.
I mean, it's an interesting point that you make, because even as we've watched the war between Gaza and Gaza and Israel, many pundits have argued that this is more of an energy war than it is about so much as it is about the land issue. And I don't know what you say about that, Mr. Biniza, because you've got what Dr. Makubela is saying there, the closing of the Strait of Hormuz having massive energy availability implications for all, and not just, surely not just the West, but for Africa as well, but perhaps even for the Middle East?
Sure. So I think the conflict in Iran is slightly a bit more complex. In my book, at least, it seems quite clear it's the same playbook that the US went by in Iraq when the US was claiming that they were weapons of mass destruction. Fast forward to where we are today, we know that they didn't have such evidence. We know that the scapegoat of weapons of mass destruction was used as just as a way to accelerate the conflict. And obviously, I feel that Israel, being a close ally to the US, is also playing the same book. It doesn't make sense to me why President Trump would, on the one hand, try to promote peace and a solution to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but at the same side, be interested in getting a US involvement in the Israeli-Iranian conflict. And so there's a lot of issues obviously involved. I'm not sure whether the US could also take on the implications of the Israeli-Iranian war if the prices in terms of oil as projected in former Ambassador views around $200 a barrel is something that the U.S. economy can sustain, given that they're also still dealing with tariff, also still dealing with the highly impact or delayed impact of inflation on that. And to throw the whole entire world into a global recession, which is likely if we're talking $300 a barrel oil in this slow growth environment, is going to have severe, massive implications, not just to the Middle East, globally. And so, I'm not certain as to why, on the one hand, President Trump would say he's promoting peace, whilst on the other hand wants to get involved in the conflict with Israel and Iran. And again, it seems to me it's the same playbook we've seen the US use with weapons of mass destruction, with these suggestions that supposedly Iran has, nuclear weapons and bunkers so deep that they've survived the first week of shelling, and that, they're at around 900 meters below the ground, and that's why they're not accessible or they're not been affected thus far due to the current bombing. Again, it's just a storybook from the US global foreign policy playbook, in my view.
Advocate Mantula, just how much power does US President Donald Trump really have here in getting the US involved? You got Bernie Sanders, the senator, who says it is Congress that determines whether we go to war, not the president. He must not take the illegal military action against Iran. Could he go around Congress?
Naledi, that cannot happen. But as we have seen the Trump administration, as my fellow panelists have said, how America is viewed and how they've been playing this script out. I think for the US is to also undermine the international law, is to undermine the United Nations Security Council, because all threats of war, as even the viewers and callers have raised this issue of the plight of humanity, and America not understanding that the same plight that we see of Iraq and Iran playing out is the same of undermining, like I've said, the international law. And for him to undermine Congress also will be also to be casting doubt to the electorates in the US. But what is also important, it is the role of also the International Court of Justice. It will also be important to look at the UN Security Council P5, because normally when you have such incidents, you have back-to-back meetings that others are clandestine, secret meetings going on. But how do we protect the US? And like we have said, this G7 meeting that is happening in Canada, it is also another opportunity to try to change the minds of people like Trump about reminding him about silencing of guns globally, not only in Africa, but also silencing of guns in the Middle East.
Yeah, I've said this a few times, President Cyril Ramaphosa really spending a lot of the time in an unenviable position. And once again, there he is in this meeting. And I wonder what you three gentlemen would, write the script for him to say as he speaks to some of his counterparts in Canada. But let's quickly take some calls. 0105 9460 10. Muluki is in Mahikeng. Muluki, good evening. Thank you for calling.
Good evening, ma'am.
Yes, Muluka, thank you for calling. Talk to us. We're listening.
Am I on air?
You are on air, sir.
Yeah. Look, we realize the geopolitical implications of this war. But us here in the South have our own issues. And we should not have our finger in the war pies of other countries. Whether it's the Ukraine, the DRC, Gaza, and now Iran.
Okay, but you're listening to the TV as well. So, Muluki, I'm going to let you go, but I think your point is made that we have our own issues here in the South and that we need to perhaps stay this one out. Let's take a short break. When we come back, what is it that the president says at a time like this? In a moment. Welcome back. We continue as we look at the matter of the rising tensions between Iran and Israel, and we look at what it is that South Africa needs to be contributing to that bigger global debate, if at all, as some of our viewers have commented, that we need to be rather staying out of it. But let's take a look at some of our other viewers and what they had to say via WhatsApp. Tharman Naidu in Alberton says, good evening. If the world's superpowers can't do anything, South Africa is even wasting time making comments. Okay, Tharman, thank you so much for that. Shange A in Mangozi says, South Africa has just been embarrassed by the M23 rebels in the DRC. There's no role that can be played by SANDF. They're weak and ill-equipped, only a moral support. We can't risk a weak army in a serious war. Agnes Mapela says, please, South Africa, don't touch Israel embassy. Distance yourself from whatever is happening. When you were sidelined by USA, no one helped you, everyone for himself. Please move away from Israel. When Saudi Arabia is not involving themselves to support their own, but why South Africans? Agnes, thank you for sending in that message. Sibuleke says, good evening, Naledi. South Africa is, by extension, Africa. Economic ties with the West is essentially limiting it from independently expressing itself on such clear violation of international laws. At extension, such an important one. Dr. Makubela, again, the president in an unenviable position. And you know, he obviously represents us at this G7 meeting as president of the country, but it is not unknown that as president of the ANC, there are also certain political stances. What is it that he says? And you hear that one WhatsApp that coming in there from the viewer who says, South Africa is by extension Africa. He's the only African leader that is there at the moment.
Naledi, you know, there's a misconception that countries must always be neutral. There's nothing called neutrality. You are neutral on issues to the dispute, but you can't remain deaf to issues that are causing mayhem and loss of life. You have to take a stand in terms of your position to say the death and the killing must stop. So that's a position. You then become neutral on issues that are causing the dispute. That's how we deal with this issue. But the president, there are two issues that are on the agenda of the G7, Naledi. It's a question of global conflicts and the energy security. But I'm speaking about the global conflict because it's part of the G20 program that will come from the G7. So there's some level of continuation that the president needs to manage. But when you look at the agenda of the G7, the only country they've invited that they're interacting with is around Ukraine. There are other global conflicts that are taking place that are really decimating life. I don't know who's the president going to invite. Being in Africa, the expectation will be that he invites countries from the Sahel in East Africa that are involved in the conflict in the Horn of Africa, and to really try to have a dialogue and expand this notion that a conflict that requires attention is the only conflict in Ukraine and in the Middle East. He needs to broaden that. Yeah. I think there's a challenge that he has, but this is not his only stable. He has other people in the stable who are going to be very resistant to the issue of including Africans because, you know, they're looking at money. It's going to cost money to do that. South Africa would have to represent the continent in this respect. But Naledi, with respect to this conflict going on in the Middle East, this is one conflict that is redefining the new global order. It has a potential to spiral into the Third World War, given the interests of big powers involved in this. But at the same time, it changes the dynamics in terms of the sea route and the movement of ships around the world. And the question of the Cape of Good Hope becomes very relevant, and it becomes a contested space. I have in the past raised the question about why the fight around Simonstown Naval Base, which is huge with big capacity. So we're going to see a lot of interest around that. We're going to see contestation by big powers around that. So we need to redefine our strategic objective in the world as to what is that we want to do and how is that we want to utilize our geostrategic location. There are already people within the United States who are saying that South Africa the United States should not give up on the Simonstown and the geostrategic importance of Simonstown. There's a guy called Messevi who wrote an article. He sits in the think tank that is called the Hudson think tank. He wrote an article that is quite intriguing. But the Hudson think tank, it's a conservative think tank that is currently influencing the thinking in the current administration. So we got to take that very serious.
Yeah. Dr. Makhubele, that's a mouthful. And there's also been, a wanting of walking on eggshells without using the words, the potential to spiral into a third world war. Advocate Mandula, I want you to take it from here, please, if you will. Dr. Makhubele talking about how this being a moment that could change the very global order. That is a heavy load for the president to carry in Canada. What does he say if you were to be there with him and speaking in his ear?
No, correctly, Naledi. It might spiral us to the global disorder also that we might see mayhem and chaos. But within the presidency and our foreign ministry, we have been raising this issue of Article 51 of the self-defense that has been misinterpreted by Israel and in all these conflicts. And also when you look at the question of humanitarian crisis that we see looming in the continent, and correctly that we are in Africa by extension, but we are also representing aspiration of many African countries that are embroiled in conflict. And for a simple international law principles, Naledi, the president knows very well that when people talk about war, they must prepare for peace. And vis-a-vis, when you talk of peace, you have to prepare for war. But what is important is for him to galvanize that support that goes to the AU Agenda 2063. It goes to our national priorities also as South Africa. Remember that, like earlier, I did talk about our pillars, that if we are talking about the Ubuntu foreign policy, where do we bring humanity in these conflicts? How do we arrest all these conflicts that are even resource-based? Because remember that all these conflicts that we see in the globe, they are driven by greedy and they are also driven by appetite on the natural resources that are there.
Right. Advocate Mandula, I'm running out of time, but Sia, I need to let you have your final thought here. How do we ensure that we prioritize our economic needs in a matter like this, particularly in the meeting in Canada? If you can bring it down to 30 seconds. I'm squeezing you. I'm sorry.
Sure. No problem, Naledi. Look, I think it's quite clear from what former Ambassador Dr. Makhubele said that, Africa as a whole and as a region is the, I think, stomping ground of the next contestation, whether that be about alternative routes post this Israeli-Iranian conflict. If it turns out to be a World War III, South Africa is going to be on the spotlight of that. Whether that be in terms of energy security, the Middle East holds the carbon energy security of the past. Africa is where the minerals and critical minerals are found for the energy security of the so-called future that, the global just energy transition is trying to usher in.
Yeah.
Fortunately, for the sake of President Ramaphosa, he's not alone. He has to split the G20 into two. Those who are still following the footsteps of US and partnering with countries like Canada, the UK, as well as Germany, who more recently have started to see the light when it comes to Israeli-related issues.
Right.
And so he needs to play that against the dominant influences such as the US in order to broker peace in the G7 discussions.
Yeah, it's an interesting perspective. Gentlemen, it's been such a pleasure speaking to you, and thank you so much for availing yourselves. Sia Biniza, Executive Director for Political Economy, Southern Africa. Advocate Sipho Mantula, apologies for that, International Relations Expert. Dr. Kingsley Makhubela, who's a former diplomat and international relations expert himself. Let's take one last caller. Sifudi is in Randfontein. Sifudi, good evening to you.
Naledi, good evening to you and your guests.
Thank you for calling, Sifudi. Talk to us.
The global dynamics are becoming trickier day by day. But I would like to call out China and Russia. Where are they? They shouldn't be pedestrian in this bigger game that is being played by the Western nation. To me, I say Africa is not yet ready for this global dynamics because we are unable to leverage what we got. We are not unable to present a united front until we divorce ourselves from the francophone, anglophone, and the lusophone and maintain the real Africa and fight back and unite ourselves.
All right.
We are going to be continuously divided.
Right.
And
Sifudi,
good evening to you.
Good evening to you, Sifudi. Sifudi says unite Africa first, calling in from Randfontein. It's been an interesting discussion, certainly. But stay with us on Newsfeed PM, the late edition. More news on the other side of this.